For decades, cinema has lied to you about Wuthering Heights. And not just a little bit, not just that, oh, they cut a scene here or there. No, I mean they structurally lied. So if you've only watched the films, even the classic, that moody black and white one your English teacher might have shown you in class, or if you decided to go watch that new 2026 Pinterest dark romance fever dream BDSM God knows what, listen, you only know half the story and you know the wrong half. You might think this book is a tragic romance. You might think it's about a brooding bad boy and this wild girl running across the Yorkshire moors, until, of course, they die dramatically and become ghosts. You might think the ending is slow and it's all about longing and it's just, I can't live without you, and that's where it all ends. Or worse, if you saw that new 2026 version, you might think the ending is sepsis, leeches, aggressive yearning, and begs to be haunted in the future. But I promise you, Emily Brontë did not write a romance. She wrote a two-generation power struggle. She wrote a revenge epic about property, humiliation, inheritance, class, race, and the like, and how a man who weaponizes the legal system, mind you, they probably didn't even think he could use that system to destroy two families from the inside out. And then, this is the part Hollywood keeps deleting. The fact that she wrote a whole second half, an entire second generation of children, and that second generation is the moral of the story. So when I see a movie that doesn't include Catherine Linton Heathcliff, and most criminally, Hareton Earnshaw, I am big mad. So today, we are correcting the record. We are doing the deep dive together. We are going to walk through the entire novel. We're going to talk about the narrators. We're going to get into a family tree. We're going to get into inheritance law, generational trauma, unreliable storytelling, just all the things. And then, and only then, once we understand the full architecture of the novel, then we're going to talk about the 1939 classic and the new 2026 movie. Because if you don't understand what they cut, you can't understand what they broke. So grab your tea, grab your coffee, your wine, whatever your beverage of choice is, because this is going to be an audit of Wuthering Heights. Now, here's the thing. Right now, culturally, Wuthering Heights is trending again, which is wild when you really think about the fact that this book came out in 1847. And critics at the time called it very savage and unnatural and just very morally bankrupt and dangerous. And what's worse, they thought negatively about it when they thought a man wrote it. Then, of course, when they discovered a woman, oh my gosh, they were all up in arms. It was really received as disturbing. But somewhere along the way, we turned it into a Gothic soulmate story. And I don't know about you, but I've had teachers who've pointed this out. The fact that the novel contains a romance. It has a romance in there, but it's not a romance novel. It's actually closer to horror, closer to a revenge saga, actually closer to Succession, okay, with Ghost, than it is to Pride and Prejudice or any feel-good romance. And I think part of the confusion comes from the structure, because the book is messy, all right? It's not a linear novel. It's framed inside other narrators. It jumps time. It forces you to track two generations across two houses with similar names. So you're going to need a family tree open next to you. And when something kind of gets that structurally complex, I think now film adaptations simplify it. And when they simplify it, you have to change it to simplify it. So again, we're going to get into narrators and framing. We're going to get into the full family tree. I have this whole wall I did for you all. We're going to get into generation 1, which is how everything started. We're going to get into the inheritance bit of it all. We're going to get into generation 2, the part that really changes the meaning of the book. We're going to talk about Nellie's reliability, right? And what might be darker than we're told. And then we're going to jump into 1939 versus the 2026 films and why this matters now, most importantly. So this isn't the TikTok version, all right? This is, we are chatting, we are breaking things down. And we need to start with the frame of the novel, right? Which is rooted in unreliable storytelling. So before we can even talk about Heathcliff, before we can talk about Catherine, we really need to sit back, let me sit back too, and talk about who is telling the story. Because Wuthering Heights is not straightforward, like I said. It's not a straightforward narrative. It's layered. It opens. This novel opens in 1801 with Mr. Lockwood. He rents this property called Thrushcross Grange. Now, he ends up visiting his landlord at Wuthering Heights because, it was bad weather out. And what he walks into is a nightmare. First of all, there's dogs attacking him. The house itself feels hostile. The people are barely speaking. There's something wrong in the air. Listen, all of that is important because guess what? Lockwood is us. He's you and I. He's an outsider who comes into this situation and misreads it completely. He sees Heathcliff, just brooding over there in silence. He's probably thinking, he has depth, he has mystery, maybe there's some romance, But then the novel dismantles all those assumptions. Then we get Nellie Dean. Nellie is a housekeeper. Now, she is the narrator within the narrator. So everything we know about the past comes through Nellie. And here's where it gets interesting. Nellie is not neutral, all right? She prefers the Lintons. She interferes in events. She withholds information. She makes choices. And she is telling this entire story to a complete stranger. So you really have to stop and ask yourself, what is she softening? What is she not saying? What is she justifying? What is she omitting? Because let's be for real, okay? Sidebar, just stick a pin in it. Think about it. You have this deep, dark, family secret knowledge about these two households. And this random person, this outsider who's not from your town, not from your area, comes in and they're like, oh, what's going on with the neighbors? You're going to tell them a tad bit about the neighbors, but you're not really going to get into the details of it all. You know what I mean? You're going to hold back. You don't know these people. I don't know about you, but I don't spill secrets to people I don't really know that well. So with that in mind, if you pay attention to the novel closely, the book kind of hints that things might have been even darker than Nellie allowed herself to articulate, because she describes violence, but sometimes vaguely. She describes cruelty, but filters it through moral commentary. And that framing for me matters, because the novel is already disturbing within itself, and we're receiving it secondhand. Listen, I don't know, but again, this isn't just a normal story. It's not a story even about trauma. It's a story about trauma told by someone who survived it, which means also it's open to interpretation, which means bias. So already, structurally, this book is more complex than, oh, they're just two people in love. It's a story filtered through class, position, moral bias, resentment, hindsight, and all the things. And we haven't even reached the revenge plot yet. Okay, so let's pause. I did a character map. I actually did a family tree. So let's go over to a wall in the hallway of my house that I took over to give you the family tree. I've seen so many readers share online over the years how incredibly difficult it is to keep track of all the characters in Wuthering Heights, especially the members of the two households. So of course we have Wuthering Heights and we have Thrushcross Grange. So I've put up a family tree on my wall here to explain all the family members from each house individually, but also how the houses merge, and most importantly, talk about the children, because that is also a place where, there's a bit of confusion that occurs. Most importantly, if you've only ever watched the adaptations, then you've completely missed the fact that there is a whole other generation, because all these people, we've seen them get into relationships, we've seen them gotten married. However, they do have children. So today I'm going to break down each household. We're going to zoom in first on Wuthering Heights, then we're going to get into Thrushcross Grange, and then we're going to talk about how they merge together. So moving backwards, we're going to start with Wuthering Heights first. So with Wuthering Heights, we have head of household, we have Mr. Earnshaw, and we have Mrs. Earnshaw. Now, they have two biological children. They have Hindley Earnshaw and they have Catherine Earnshaw. Now, if you notice, I've used my yarn to do a lot of the connecting. I hope you can see the color differences. But I have a bit of yarn that stretches from Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw all the way over here. This is Heathcliff. Now, Heathcliff is not their biological child. Heathcliff is a boy Mr. Earnshaw brought back from his trip in Liverpool. Now, it's very important to note, because again, depending on if you just only watch the first adaptation, you completely miss the fact that Mr. Earnshaw absolutely adored Heathcliff. He really favored him. He even favored him to the point where his own son felt threatened, but more on that later. So, Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw, they have their two children, Hindley Earnshaw and Catherine Earnshaw. And of course, I have Heathcliff all the way over here because Heathcliff is not biologically an Earnshaw. He was never, officially adopted, and his fortune changed after Mr. Earnshaw died. However, the household he did marry into is the Linton. So we're going to get into the Linton household, and we're going to start with the head of household. So the Lintons, they live at Thrushcross Grange. We have a Mr. Linton and we have Mrs. Linton. Now, they have two biological children. They have Edgar Linton, their son, and their daughter, Isabella Linton. Now we're going to get into the marriages. And since I'm already here at the house of Linton, it's important to note that Isabella Linton marries Heathcliff. Now, the joining of the two households, okay, the Earnshaws and the Lintons, officially happens through the marriage of Edgar Linton and Catherine Earnshaw. Okay. Moving on to the other sibling, Hindley Earnshaw marries a woman named Frances. So we have her here, Frances Earnshaw. Now, I'm not sure if you can see the colors that I have used to, kind of make my family tree here. I used blue for the Earnshaws to indicate blood relation. So like I said, Mr. Earnshaw and Mrs. Earnshaw have their two children, Hindley and Catherine. Now, the Lintons, Mr. and Mrs. Linton, have their two children, Edgar and Isabella. The people who married in are in yellow. So that's why I have Heathcliff over here in yellow. And this is why I have Frances here also in yellow, because they married in. Now, odds are, again, if you watched the adaptations, you might have missed some of the marriages, depending on the adaptation you watched, of course, because the focus really isn't on the other siblings as much in the adaptations. However, these marriages produced children. So that's when we move on to the next generation. So we're going to start with the Earnshaws. So remember, Hindley marries Frances. Now, unfortunately, Frances passes away shortly after giving birth to Hareton Earnshaw. So Hareton is Hindley's heir. This is very important. Now, Catherine Earnshaw and Edgar Linton, they got married. And in all adaptations that I've watched anyway, I have seen where they've depicted that Catherine died, but they make it seem like Catherine has died from a separate illness. Now, the 2026 adaptation does indicate she had a miscarriage and she died from sepsis and the like. However, in the novel, she is ill. However, she dies after giving birth to a daughter. So Catherine Earnshaw and Edgar Linton's daughter is Catherine Linton. Now, I know this can be super confusing for readers because, again, Catherine was an Earnshaw. She married Edgar Linton, so she becomes a Linton, Catherine Linton. However, like I said, she passes away, and the daughter is also named Catherine Linton, but we're going to call her Kathy, okay? Kathy Jr., Catherine Jr. I will throw in the Jr. just to differentiate so you don't think I'm talking about, big Catherine, Mom Catherine, okay? Now, also in the marriage between Isabella Linton and Heathcliff, that also produces a child. And that child is named Linton Heathcliff. Now, I know this can be a tad bit confusing because you're like, wait, she's a Linton and she's married. So Heathcliff? So what is going on with the names? So, of course, she wanted the child to carry on the family name. So because she was a Linton, she named the child Linton. And because Heathcliff is just Heathcliff, the child is named Linton Heathcliff. Now, what happens with their children is also part of the drama because we have marriages continuing as well. But before I get into the marriages, it's very important to point out a few things. We're going back to the beginning. We're starting again. Remember, Mr. Earnshaw and Mrs. Earnshaw have two children. They happen to have both a boy and a girl. Now, because of the patriarchal society at the time, when Mr. Earnshaw passes away, Wuthering Heights and, the family's estate and property and money and all the things would pass to Hindley Earnshaw because, again, it was a very patriarchal system at the time. Now, when Hindley has a child, in this case, he had a son right off the bat. So he has his heir. So whatever Hindley has when Hindley passes away, it should go to Hareton. All right, I think that makes sense for most people. Now, let's look at Catherine and Edgar Linton. Now, because Catherine married, she leaves Wuthering Heights and she cleaves onto her husband, as was the custom back then. Because when Mr. and Mrs. Linton pass away, again, even though they have two children, right, all the property from the Lintons are going to pass down to Edgar. All right. Isabella, because she marries off, she would cleave to her husband, and whatever, she would live with her husband, and her husband would provide. So all the inheritances always pass through the boys. Now, because Edgar and Catherine have a daughter, what that means is whoever she marries, right? Because they only have this one child. So once her father passes, right, things would go to her, but technically not her, again, because of the patriarchal society. So it would go to her husband. This is a very important point. Now, like I said, Isabella marries Heathcliff. So because all the inheritance of the Lintons would go to Edgar, listen, if Edgar wants to give his sister a bit of money, he's free to do so. However, she is living with Heathcliff, and that is important to note because look, now they have a child. So that child is a boy. So whatever Isabella has or Heathcliff has, it would pass down to the boy because they have a boy. All right. This is important to note because now that we're getting into the third generation, this is where the drama begins. So the drama begins because now the Earnshaws have passed on. Hindley is head of household. Now, his wife has passed away. Now, Hindley, when he passes away, technically speaking, Wuthering Heights should have gone to his son. However, he was entrapped by Heathcliff. Heathcliff took advantage of the fact that he was a gambler. He would drink. He was in heavy debt. Heathcliff essentially used the legal system, which I will get into in further detail, to essentially become owner of Wuthering Heights. So when he takes over Wuthering Heights now, Heathcliff does. That means, technically speaking, it would pass on to his son. All right. However, when Hindley passes away, Heathcliff is master at Wuthering Heights because he now owns a property because he basically got it from up under Hindley. Heathcliff turns Hareton into a servant, essentially a servant like he was at one point. Now, it's very important to note, like I said, when Edgar Linton is ill, because he only has one child and that child is a daughter, the daughter would have, she would have inherited it. But because of the system, she would have needed a husband and the husband would have taken control. So because Heathcliff wanted revenge, okay, he married Isabella, hoped to produce an heir so that he could use his son and manipulate his son to also take over Thrushcross Grange and just everything the Lintons owned. So Edgar Linton passes away. Remember, everything went to him. So what does Heathcliff do in an attempt to control Thrushcross Grange as well? He convinces his son to pursue Catherine Linton. It got so bad to the point where he locked up Catherine because Catherine, poor thing, grew up very sheltered, had no idea what was going on. But anyway, she ends up marrying Linton Heathcliff. And this is how Heathcliff, because he was manipulating his son, this is how Heathcliff got control of both Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. Now, unfortunately, Heathcliff's son is quite sickly, so he passes away. So Cathy is now a widow, not widower, but Cathy is a widow. So Heathcliff is already controlling both properties, but we see Cathy and Hareton start, a relationship, a friendship, getting to know each other, falling in love, deciding, what, we're going to break the cycle and all the things. Heathcliff sees this, he loses it, he passes away. So that is how the property goes back to Hareton Earnshaw properly. So we see Cathy Linton making plans to marry Hareton Earnshaw and then making plans to leave Wuthering Heights and go to the Grange because, listen, they just want to get away from the drama. So I hope this visual aid has helped to explain a bit of the happenings and the goings-ons. And I know what you're thinking. Hold on a second. Aren't these two cousins? Yes, they are. They are cousins. But back then, marrying a cousin was acceptable. All right. It was acceptable. And you will find, which is part of my thesis and my feeling and my theory always, that Wuthering Heights was always about Hindley and Heathcliff, okay, and power and control and money and property. Because in the end, it was all about, again, control and who was master of this house and how they would lead that house accordingly. So there's that. But anyways, we will continue to insert this family tree a bit more because I know having the family tree will provide understanding. Also, I will have a link to the family tree over on my blog so that you can head on over there and be able to visually see in real time, not necessarily through a video, so you can keep track of who's who as you read Wuthering Heights for the first time or you are currently rereading and you're looking for more clues. Now, these two houses and two families are very different. Let's start with the houses because the Heights is very raw, stormy, violent, hierarchical, whereas the Grange is very polished, wealthy, socially refined. And we see Heathcliff moving between them, not as a lover, but as a destabilizer. And this is crucial because Heathcliff is described as dark and repeatedly racialized. Brontë doesn't spell it out explicitly, but the text definitely gives us some hints. Number one, he's ethnically ambiguous, he is socially alien, and he's very disruptive to the class structure when he enters the Earnshaw home and Yorkshire in general. First of all, he disrupts the hierarchy because we also see Mr. Earnshaw clearly favoring Heathcliff, and his own biological son, Hindley, cannot stand it. And that is where the engine starts. Again, it's not rooted in romance, it's actually rooted in jealousy and inheritance anxiety and fear of displacement. And I want us to stick a pin for a second, all right? Stick a pin for a second and let's think about what if Mr. Earnshaw had brought home a little girl? Let's just think about that for a second. Would Hindley be as threatened by, another little girl being adopted and brought into the family? I've always had my conspiracy theory that because it was a boy, a male, that really helped to set Hindley off, not counting the fact that Mr. Earnshaw was very loving and affectionate to him, and again, treated him like a son. Now, we have to get into more details about how Heathcliff came to be. The Heathcliff we see as the novel progresses and at the end. And yes, we don't know much about his background, but we do know he was othered and he's brought into this house and he's favored. Now, how do Cathy and Heathcliff kind of bond? I think that's very important. So when we look at the house at the time, the one person who was feeling very threatened was Hindley. However, when Mr. Earnshaw passes away, woof, that's when things go completely left. And that's when Cathy and Heathcliff bond. Because now the household, without Mr. Earnshaw, has become hostile under Hindley. And Heathcliff becomes the primary target of Hindley's cruelty. First of all, he's kicked out of the house. What status he had as the adopted son was stripped. Education ceased. Dignity, just everything. And just imagine mentally going from favored child to servant, being humiliated beyond your imagination. It was wild. So we see Catherine bonding with him, not because, he's good looking and he's sexy, but because they're both resisting the structure that they're in within that household. They run to the moors because the house itself becomes so oppressive. Now, here's the difference. Catherine, because she is of the Earnshaw bloodline, there's nothing ambiguous about Catherine. She has a choice. Now, Heathcliff doesn't have the same choices and options Catherine has. And that is very important. Because here's the thing. Catherine can marry up, and move her station up in life and escape this house. Heathcliff, it's not that simple for him. He can't marry up. And this is where, that famous line about, it would degrade me to marry Heathcliff bit that he overhears. And of course, yes, he only overhears part of it. And then he eventually leaves. But we need to pause because I think this is where the film pivots to romance and the book pivots to strategy instead. Because here's the thing. When Heathcliff returns, when he comes back years later and he's wealthy, all right, he didn't come back for just love. And I think that's what really, kind of like infuriates me when I read the book. Brontë makes it very clear. First of all, him returning is not just a glow up of, what we would say in today's world. It's a whole recalibration. Again, he doesn't return for love. He returns for revenge, but also, most importantly, leverage. Because this is where the inheritance plot and scheming starts to happen. Because he now starts lending money to Hindley. He encourages Hindley's gambling and bad habits and drinking. He positions himself legally as well. So he leverages the debt, secures all the thing, and now he is the owner of Wuthering Heights. And how does he do this? Through financial entrapment, using the legal system at the time. And I want us to just kind of pause here a bit because here's the thing. All right. He uses a system that folks of that time, it's the last thing they would be expecting, because again, they look down at him as, this dirty gypsy boy, uneducated, you're just a farmhand, there's no brain up there, right? And he takes out his revenge in a way where it's not rage, it's paperwork, it's legal, it's a long game. And part of me feels that is scarier, all right? That is so scary. But you know what? He does it, and he does it successfully. So it's important to note that Hindley was married at this time. Hindley also had a son, so there's a young boy in the mix. So when Heathcliff does all of this as well, Hindley has a family, and that is important to remember. Now, Heathcliff is back, and he wanted to ruin Hindley. But you know who else he wants to ruin as well? The Lintons. And let's be very clear. It's also not about the fact that Catherine married, Edgar Linton. No, it's not just about that. It's because the Lintons also looked down on Heathcliff as this dirty gypsy boy of no status. And, they really looked at him as hired help. They didn't respect, the backstory of the fact that, Heathcliff is more. So anyway, now let's see how he's going to take out his revenge. Okay, not just rage and anger, also on the Lintons. And this is where Isabella Linton comes into the mix. So what does he do? He marries Isabella, not just to piss Catherine off. He has a plan with the marriage. And we need to also be clear that he was violently abusive to Isabella in the novel. This is not melodramatic. This is not romanticized. No, she didn't want it. This was abusive. And again, why does he marry her? He wants access to the Linton family line. This is a clear connection because the Grange is governed by male line property systems, the whole entails and settlements and all the patriarchal structures of the time. And what does Heathcliff do? He decides, listen, I am going to exploit this to the umpteenth degree. So the best way to get into the family is marry into the family. He also happens to produce a male heir, and that positions him in a level of leverage that he plans to weaponize, again, using the patriarchal system. So this is not passion. This is real estate acquisition here. So we also need to talk about the fact that he marries Isabella. They have a child, but Catherine dies. And in most adaptations, this is where the film stops, but the novel doesn't. And I actually believe this is where the story gets juicier, undeniable. It's just insane. Because here's the thing, the first generation is one thing, but this second generation, they are coming in hot. Now, one thing the films don't show is the fact that Catherine Earnshaw, married Linton, gives birth to a daughter. Her daughter is also a Catherine, but we're going to call her Kathy for short. So that is Kathy Linton. And I know it kind of confuses readers, which is why, again, we have the family tree to help guide you. So now, Hindley is ruined. Hindley also passes away, but he has a son, Hareton. Catherine dies, but she leaves her daughter, Catherine Linton. And Isabella and Heathcliff have their child, Linton Heathcliff. So now we are really going to get into the drama because the second generation is where it's at. So again, if you stopped reading when Catherine dies, if all you've ever experienced is the adaptation that ends when Catherine dies, you stopped at the emotional explosion because Brontë didn't end with that explosion. She ended with consequences. And this is where the novel becomes unmistakably about the power dynamics. So we're going to reset the board. We have to reset the board. We have to go back to the family tree because we have the parents and now we're into the children. Because again, Catherine Earnshaw dies. 3 children remain in the wreckage. So we have 3 heirs. We also have 3 legal pathways. We also have 3 emotional mirrors. These are not side characters. They are the resolution of everything that has been happening. And this is where the entire meaning of the book shifts. So let's get into Linton Heathcliff first, because he is the pawn. So if you still think Heathcliff, again, is romantic, anti-hero, all the things, the chapters involving his son should end that fantasy immediately. Heathcliff does not love Linton. Instead, he uses him. Unfortunately, Linton is weak, he's sickly, he's nervous, again, chronically ill. And Heathcliff despises the weakness because I feel it reminds him of his vulnerability, but yet still he needs Linton because of, again, property law, because of male line inheritance, because, again, of leverage. Because here's the thing, if Cathy Jr. marries his son, Linton Heathcliff, then her property rights shift. Her financial future becomes entangled. And guess who gains direct control? Heathcliff. So this is not love. It's a hostile takeover. He imprisons Cathy Jr. at Wuthering Heights, pressures her into marriage, and then isolates her from her dying father. He manipulates his son Linton into compliance, and he engineers this whole legal outcome. And when the marriage is secure, unfortunately, Linton dies. And now, guess who controls Thrushcross Grange? Heathcliff. He now has seized both houses. Again, not because of love, not by passion, by legal paperwork. And this is not the arc of a misunderstood lover. I mean, forgive me. I think this is the arc of a man who weaponizes patriarchy and the legal system. And that systematic cruelty, I think, is far more disturbing than, let's just say, impulsive violence. I mean, listen, we do not support violence, and he is very violent, but it shows you, like, he is playing the long game. He isn't about, instant gratification, you know? But anyway, we have to talk about Catherine Jr. Catherine Jr. is the bridge. Catherine Jr. is the blend of both houses. She inherits her mother's spirit. She has her father's refinement. She has her mother's intensity. She also has her father's civility. And unlike Catherine Earnshaw, she grows up incredibly protected, very sheltered, highly educated. She doesn't even know the storm that is happening next door yet. And when she first meets Hareton, and Hareton is Hindley's son, she mocks him. She humiliates him. She thinks he's silly, he's dumb, he's illiterate, all these things. And this is very critical, because without knowing, it's mirroring. And this is where Brontë is showing us repetition, cycles, generational things, you know, the echoes, the fact that the second generation begins by repeating the mistakes of the first. However, and this is a big however, here's the difference. Cathy Jr. is also capable of growth, because when she realizes the cruelty of what she's done, she changes and she chooses differently. And I think that choice is everything, because for me, that says, hello, this generation is not doomed. Now, of course, we have to get into Hareton Earnshaw. He's the true inheritor, because when we talk about the character that no film wants to deal with, it's Hareton. And I really don't understand it, because I love Hareton, okay? Now, Hareton, again, is Hindley's son. He is the rightful heir to Wuthering Heights, but of course, his father has passed, and now Heathcliff is raising him. And he is deliberately raising him uneducated. He's denied him all opportunities for literacy, refinement. He's keeping him socially diminished, and this is revenge by replication. Heathcliff is recreating his own humiliation in Hindley's child. And, you know, this is where we can pause and say, in real life, there are two things that happen when people go through extreme trauma. They repeat it or they break it. But we also have a devastating twist, because Hareton loves Heathcliff. Like, he actually admires him. He looks up to him, despite all the cruelty. And I think that dynamic is also tragic, because Heathcliff sees in Hareton what he could have been, you know, strong, rooted, wild. And yet, my gosh, he just sabotages him anyway. Hareton is both victim and inheritor. And then, of course, something changes, you know. Cathy Jr. begins teaching him to read. Again, we see repetition again. We see them sitting by the fire. She's teaching him letters. Of course, he's struggling. We see him trying again. And we see their relationship growing, not from obsession, but from patience, from kindness, not from annihilation, but from restoration. And this is where I feel the novel corrects itself, all right? The generation before, they loved, but they loved destructively. And now we have this generation. They're loving as well, but it's more constructively. And Heathcliff is watching this, like he is seeing this. And listen, something in him fractures, because he won, you know, in the end, he won. He owns both houses. He executed the revenge he wanted. He controlled the inheritance. He did the math But you know what? The math still wasn't mathing, because in the end, he has nothing. No intimacy, no warmth, no peace, no love. And when he sees Hareton and Kathy choosing differently, you know what? He loses his will. He loses his will. He stops eating, he withdraws, he fixates on Catherine's ghost more than ever. And when he dies, you know what? He's not triumphant. It's not romantic. It's actually hollow. It's really hollow. And the novel ends not with ghost lovers walking hand in hand away. No, it ends with Hareton and Kathy planning marriage, planning to move to the Grange, planning to leave the Heights behind. It's just really hard won, but hopeful ending. And I think that ending changes the genre, because when you end with Catherine's death, you know, it's more tragedy. But when you end with Hareton and Kathy, it feels more like restoration. And I can't understand for the life of me why films keep cutting that half of the novel out, truly. Now, this would not be a deep dive if we didn't complicate things further, because everything we just walked through, everything we just shared, comes from one person. It comes from Nellie. And Nellie is narrating all of this to Mr. Lockwood. But we also have to think about who is Mr. Lockwood, all right? Because again, it's all about who we tell stories and what we keep, what we filter, and the like. And Mr. Lockwood is a gentleman. He's also a tenant. All right. He's a stranger. He's an out of towner. So I really want us to ask ourselves this. Would a housekeeper describe graphic details of domestic abuse to a stranger? Or would she soften it? You know, she reports violence, but often in summary, she describes cruelty, but she filters it through moral commentary. She withholds letters. She intervenes in relationships. She also makes lots of choices that alters outcomes. And then she's telling this story as, you know what, she's just a passive observer. So when we read the novel as horror, it might actually be worse than what we were given, because Brontë leaves space for that possibility. And that instability is part of why the book feels so psychologically modern, because it's not just trauma, it's mediated trauma, which kind of makes flattening it into just a romance again even more absurd. Now, in this section, I really want to get into what Wuthering Heights is actually about. So we're really going to get into the themes, because before we touch any of the adaptations, I need us to pause, because we did a whole bunch of plot and we need that reset. So here's the reset. This is a power story. It is a protest. It is a psychological study of what happens when love is trapped inside a world built on hierarchy, where land, class, legitimacy, race, and all the things decide who gets to be human. And if you only remember one sentence from this entire video, I want you to remember that the central conflict is two men battling over power and property. And Kathy and the next generation become an extension of that war. That is the architecture. That's why this book is so savage. That's why it still feels so modern. Because we're not asking, will they end up together? It's actually asking, what does a person become when the world tells them they don't belong? And then hands them tools to retaliate. So if you stay with me through these themes, the adaptation critique will land a bit more cleanly so you can really feel it in your bones. So one of the themes we have to talk about is race, outsider status, and hierarchy, because we have to talk about Heathcliff is introduced, because in the novel doesn't treat him as this mysterious bad boy. It treats him as a disruption. He is repeatedly described as dark. He is repeatedly framed as somewhat ethnically ambiguous, and he is called a gypsy, which is the language of the period. Now, I want us to kind of dissect the gypsy bit, because I've seen so many different takes online. However, for that period, for that era, being called a gypsy was an insult that signaled outsider status. You know, you're suspicious, we don't know where you came from, you know, you don't really have a home base, you're traveling all the time. More importantly, also, it signaled social, social contamination. So I want us to be super, super careful when we really dissect what and who Heathcliff is. So going back, because I know people love to say, well, they're gypsies, they're their own people, they're their own race. Well, guess what? There are numerous people in different parts of the world, in different parts of Europe, that identify as gypsy. However, it just goes back to their beliefs, their way of life, and not necessarily signaling, okay, well, you must be Romani, because that seems to be something I've seen a lot online. We need to talk about where Heathcliff comes from, because that is a huge indicator as to who he may be or what he is as it relates to a label. And I want us to be careful again, because like I said, Brontë doesn't give us a neat origin story. You know, she doesn't give us a footnote to say he's from X. However, I personally feel she doesn't need to, because what the text, the novel shows us is over and over is that everyone around him treats him as not like them, not one of them. So not fully human to them, not fully legitimate, and not fully safe. And that is the theme of where he's from, Liverpool, because Mr. Earnshaw brings him home from Liverpool, which was an enormous port city in that era. It is a place tied to global trade, everything as it relates to the empire, and also, again, exploitation. And I know Brontë doesn't spell it out. However, it's very important to know, okay, and just from a logistics point of view, Liverpool at that time was a larger port city than even London. And I know a lot of people focus on, like, you know, big cities like London, even Bristol. It was bigger than Bristol at the time. And again, it was a part of the transatlantic slave route. Okay. So there could be people coming from there. Also people from the East Indies, because again, you know, we're thinking about the empire and just, you know, they had their tentacles all over the world at that point. There was lots of indentured workers, indentured servants that are coming from the East Indies, you know, different countries in Southeast Asia, Asia and the like, and just, you know, from all these different countries in the East. So my conspiracy theory, and I'm just going to be honest, I think Heathcliff is mixed. I think Heathcliff was someone whose family might have worked maybe as a merchant mariner. You never know, because that was also big at the time. And when you think about merchant mariners and their ships, okay, they travel all over the world. And also there were workers aboard these ships from all over the world. And I'm just going to go on a limb and say, it was tough times back then. And this little boy probably ran away from something, or he was turned out. And I'm just going to go on a limb and say, yeah, he was of mixed race, even though, again, Brontë doesn't spell it out. However, she places Heathcliff, this outsider, inside a world where class, race, and belonging are not abstract ideas, they're social weapons. So when he walks into Yorkshire, when he comes to the house, Wuthering Heights, he isn't just entering any old family, he's entering a hierarchical system. And his presence destabilizes it immediately because Mr. Earnshaw favors him. And that's the problem, because this favoritism threatens Hindley's entitlement. That is the spark. So it's not really about romance, it's about displacement. So I think if you remove the dynamic in an adaptation, you know, you kind of really flatten it and just make it like, oh, he's misunderstood. You know, it's not just changing a tiny detail, you're weakening the engine and the structure. Because again, I want us to think, and I know I've probably posed this question a million times before, but I want us to think, what if Mr. Earnshaw, beg your pardon, had brought home a little girl? The threat wouldn't have been so grave, because again, what Hindley is afraid of is that the father favors him. The father is going to appoint him heir. He's going to be the person running Wuthering Heights. He's going to take out Hindley's inheritance from up under him. Even if that weren't the case, it's just the fear, and it's the fear of the unknown. And it didn't help, again, that he's an outsider. He is other. So that is a crucial part of the plot, and I want us to always think about that dynamic because it was a very patriarchal society. Now, I want us to get into another theme, which is about, you know, the real love story versus the real war that is happening. Now, let's name the thing people don't want to say out loud, and I'm sure you probably didn't think I would say this either, but it's a fact that Catherine and Heathcliff as a duo are quite iconic. They are. Listen, I'm not going to hold you. That is true. They're iconic. However, the novel's central conflict is not will they be together? It's Heathcliff versus Hindley. It's these two men battling over the land, over the inheritance, over the humiliation, over status. Because again, Heathcliff was favored. And then when Mr. Earnshaw passed and Hindley became master, he humiliated Heathcliff. He ripped what little status he had. And it was also, again, about who was going to be the rightful heir in the house. So again, running on the engine that is patriarchy and male entitlement. Now, Kathy is the catalyst because she intensifies the rivalry. She also becomes a site of power, and it's more an emotional and social level. But the war is still about control, and that's why the book feels like it has more in common, in my opinion, with a succession than it would say with a love story or Pride and Prejudice. We also need to talk about the theme of obsession versus love. And I feel this is where the romance myth really collapses, because Brontë isn't showing you a warm love story, a warm love, happy love that defies the odds. No, she's showing you an obsession that becomes an identity collapse. It becomes about possession, mutual destruction. It's a bond so consuming, it's indistinguishable from hatred, low key. And I don't think people think about that enough, The fact that Heathcliff might have honestly resented Catherine. And I think sometimes, honestly, resentment is more powerful than hate. I know, I had to think about that there, but I truly feel it. When someone feels slighted, like even if you're in a relationship and they resent you and they just hate where you are in life or the opportunities that you have that they don't. Because remember, Catherine has the ability to advance. Even though the household became toxic with Hindley, she can marry up, she can escape. Heathcliff doesn't have that option. And the novel to me is so brutally honest about what obsession does and how it drives people mad, how it makes you jealous, how it makes you depressed, how it makes you vindictive, reckless, Love doesn't save them. Instead, love is inside, but it rots them from the inside out, and it also rots the system. Now, we have to talk about the theme as it revolves around property and patriarchy, because the whole inheritance engine is the theme that adaptations keep treating like, oh, it's a minor inconvenience. But I think that is the story, because Heathcliff doesn't just lash out. He learns how the system works, how the world works, how the legal bit works, and uses it. Debt, marriage, male line inheritance, legal leverage, and all the things. He even turns society's rules into weapons. And the horror isn't just what he does, it's that the structure allows it. The law becomes part of the violence, and it just tells you how unbalanced it truly was at that time. Another theme we have to talk about is trauma and whether it cycles and how you can break it, because the first generation really creates the wound and the second generation answers the question, well, does cruelty have to reproduce? Because Hindley humiliates Heathcliff, then Heathcliff replicates that humiliation onto Hareton. And we see Catherine's cruelty echoes in Cathy Jr. at first. So we see that repetition there. And then Brontë does something rare. She lets the cycle break, not through grand gestures or great awakenings, but through slow change. And for me, that was so realistic because we don't change overnight. And when you really apply it to like present day, just 10 years ago, I would say it was a stigma to talk about going to therapy and needing that help and that support. Whereas now, it has become a bit more mainstream. I mean, don't get me wrong, mental health still has a stigma, but more people are openly talking about therapy. People are openly talking about needing medication, and it's a normal part of their life. Can you imagine what the future 10 years can be? However, it is always a slow change. Everything in life where we agree, disagree, where we can improve, slow change is where it's at. And we get that in the novel as well. Another theme that is a bit quiet is literacy as restoration, because the ending is essentially the thesis of this, but it's the most radical, I feel, but again, one of the more quieter themes. Because the novel ends with education, with dignity also restored. Because Hareton, when his father passes and Heathcliff is running the house, he's denied the opportunity to learn literacy and to read, and it's used as revenge. And when Cathy Jr. teaches him to read, it's not just romantic. It's kind of repair. It's the return of personhood. And I feel like once you see that, you can't unsee what an adaptation does when it cuts the whole second generation. Because if you cut that bit, you cut the cure, and instead all we're left with is this gaping wound. Okay, so now that we've named some of the themes clearly, we can talk about the adaptations. So you can see clearly what is missing, what they do right, but also what they do wrong. So I'm going to cover the adaptations one at a time, okay, as standalones, and then we'll do a comparison. So we're going to get into the 1939 film and then the 2026 adaptation. Okay, so let's talk about the 1939 version as its own work, because I actually think this is where a lot of the cultural mythology about Wuthering Heights comes from. I feel this adaptation is a version that taught people that Wuthering Heights is a tragic romance. And here's the thing, okay, unpopular opinion incoming. As a film, I think it is genuinely terrific in a lot of ways, even though it is part of the reason people think of Wuthering Heights as a romance. So let's get into the atmosphere and the craft, because I feel the film is so easy on the eyes and the ears. The cinematography is moody and textured. The storm opening works, and seeing Lockwood kind of stumble into that house, it also works as well. And the tonal shift from serene to something is very, very wrong here is one of the most faithful feelings to the reading experience. And there are moments where I feel the film almost touches the darkness of the novel, but it might pull back. Because there's also this scene where Heathcliff rejects Isabella, and you get a glimpse of something kind of existential and furious under the romance polish. So he's not just brooding, you can tell that there's something broken there. But the 1939 adaptation preserves certain things because structurally it keeps the bones of the first half of the novel. It keeps Lockwood as the outsider. It keeps Nellie as the storyteller. We see Hindley as the engine of jealousy and abuse. We see the class tension between houses, even though yes, it romanticizes the end, it still understands that the story begins as a hierarchical disruption. But with that said, the 1939 version still softens a few things because look, let's be real. It softens the brutality of it all. In the novel, Heathcliff is not just depressed and distant, he's really capable of cruelty, and we see that. And that's meant to horrify you because the book includes violence towards animals. It includes domestic abuse. It includes coercion. It includes degradation. And the film chooses, you know what, we want to make something that people can watch. So it's all about watchability, and I feel like that is a choice. However, it makes sense for 1939. I can admit that. However, it does change the moral temperature. And it also misleads us in a way as well, because then the biggest change is how it ends. Yes, it ends with Catherine's death, but it gives you the tragic soulmate myth kind of thing. It leans into romantic destiny. It turns the story into something smoother, more sentimental, because we have the ghost in the snow. And culturally, I think that ending is the problem. That is radioactive because it trained the audience to kind of stop the story at where the emotional explosion should occur. And we never get to see consequences. So it did some things right, but it definitely did some things wrong. However, I want you to hold that thought because when we look at the 2026 version, you are going to see a very different kind of unfaithfulness, all right? This is not even the old Hollywood romanticizing things. We are going full-blown modern aesthetics. So let's talk about the 2026 adaptation. And I want to be clear from the start. You are allowed to like this film. You are allowed to love the aesthetic. You are also allowed to love the intensity that you might feel. Look, I'm not grading it on vibes at all. None at all. We are grading today on architecture because once you understand the architecture of the novel, you can't ignore what's missing. Now, the first major change that I personally can't ignore is the erasure of Hindley. That, I think, is the biggest structural problem because in the novel, Hindley is not a side character. He is the ignition point, okay? He is the person who resents Heathcliff's elevation. He is the person who abuses him after Mr. Earnshaw dies. He also created the whole humiliation that fuels Heathcliff's obsession with revenge. So the central conflict is Heathcliff versus Hindley. Again, and I know you're sick of hearing it, but it is about the two men battling over inheritance, over hierarchy, over status, over legitimacy. So when the adaptation erases Hindley or minimizes him so heavily that he becomes background noise, you don't just lose a character, you lose motive. You lose the origin of the actual war. Now, in the 2026 version, we see many of Hindley's traits being absorbed into Mr. Earnshaw. So now, instead, the abuse becomes paternal brutality instead of sibling displacement. And I know you might think, well, we still have someone treating him rough, and it sounds small, but that changes everything. Because in the novel, you have to understand, Heathcliff is once favored. He is once loved. He is elevated and then violently demoted. Like, this is whiplash, okay? And that whiplash is crucial. So when you remove that nuance, Heathcliff stops being a product of a destabilized hierarchy. And it starts feeling like, okay, this is just a generic abused boy turned brooding man. And once the motive weakens, the revenge feels, again, weak, more aesthetic, instead of something systematic. Another thing flattened is the othering of it all, because we have to talk about race and outsider status. Because again, in the novel, Heathcliff's darkness is not incidental in description. He is racialized, he is othered, he's called a gypsy, and he's framed as, again, just ethnically and socially alien. And that outsider status is part of why Hindley resents him. It's part of why he's treated as less than. It's also part of the reason why the hierarchy around him, even outside the house, reacts violently. So when an adaptation ignores that tension, when it chooses a flattened aesthetic world where the dynamic has no narrative weight, the story loses friction, because Heathcliff's exclusion is not just emotional, it's also structural. Because if he is not socially displaced, then his hunger for dominance has less grounding, okay? Because again, watching the film, just kind of seeing him taking over Wuthering Heights, it's like, okay, great, but we don't get the why, the bigger why behind it. And if his hunger for dominance has that less grounding, then an entire inheritance arc feels very melodramatic. So this isn't just about casting debates for the sake of us chatting here. It's about whether the adaptation engages the tension the novel has built on. And if it doesn't, I feel the stakes really shrink. Now, the romantic reframe is where the genre shift becomes obvious. In the novel, Heathcliff is cruel, he's strategic, he's vindictive, he's psychologically violent. You are not meant to swoon at all. You are actually meant to feel quite uneasy. Now, the 2026 version, there is a heavy emphasis on physical intimacy. And again, yes, I know people had sex back then, of course. But we see more physical intimacy, more repeated declarations of love. There's that visual longing. There's that stylized sexual tension. And then when the obsession is filmed like Soulmates and Destiny, I think the genre changes. Because now the story reads like, they're two people who love each other and it's them against the world. Instead of two people destroying each other inside a very rigid world and system. And I think there's a big difference there. Because when cruelty loses consequence, when abuse is stylized or softened or made into a kink, it really stops feeling like horror and it starts to feel more like dark romance. And it's just, I don't know, that just didn't work for me. Also, we have the conflation problem by merging Hindley's cruelty into Mr. Earnshaw. I mean, something subtle is lost there because, again, Mr. Earnshaw is flawed, but he's affectionate. I think we needed that. And we needed his favoritism and how it destabilized the house because he is not the primary abuser. When you rewrite him as the central monster, you erase sibling rivalry, you ease the entitlement panic, and you erase the idea that, Heathcliff was once legitimately elevated. And I think that whiplash is very underestimated, and that matters because his tragedy wasn't just about the abuse. It was that for a moment he was included, he was a part, and then he was violently excluded. And that does something different psychologically. And of course, we have to talk about the second generation being completely gone. Again, we don't have Cathy Jr., there's no Linton Heathcliff, there's no Hareton Earnshaw, which means we don't have Or Mirrors anymore. We don't have cycle breaking. We have no literacy arc. We have no restoration. Without that second generation, the story becomes just pure decay. And if that's the artistic goal, that's okay, that's fine. But that's not Bronte's ending. Brontë doesn't end in nihilism. She ends in repair. And when you cut that repair, you really change the thesis of everything that is going on. Now, another thing with the 2026 adaptation is the visual excess versus narrative depth. So let's talk about aesthetics for a bit, because I can admit the film is visually striking. It's bold when it comes to costuming, even though I feel some of the costumes were tacky. Very textured views of the moors. The color palettes was interesting. However, visual boldness is not the same thing as thematic depth. I kind of feel like style can elevate structure, but it can't replace it. And I think the director was really going for shock value more than anything else. And for that reason, this is where many people might feel like something was off, something was missing, because the film can feel feverish. It can have that melodramatic tone and at times almost self-aware. But when the spectacle replaces the architecture, you end up with something that looks Gothic without carrying the weight of what Gothic really is. And that's why some viewers described it, as just being cheap romance, fan fiction energy. No offense to Mills and Boon and Harlequin, because we love those books too. But it's very basic. And it's not because romance is inherently lesser of a genre, of lesser of a thing to watch and enjoy, but because the complexity was just replaced with, I hate to say it, but something really basic. But with that said, here's where things get interesting, because the 1939 version romanticizes the story too. It's just that it romanticizes differently. So let's put them together side by side and do a direct comparison. Now let's evaluate them based on categories, not vibes, not personal tastes, again, structure. So let's make the first category the engine that keeps everything running. Now, in the 1939 version, it keeps Hindley, the engine. 2026 erases him, but also weakens it by making the father the primary abuser. Now, the result of that is 1939 keeps the jealousy-driven revenge arc intact, but 2026 makes revenge feel more emotionally reactive than actually socially and psychologically strategic. Let's also look at othering, because the 1939 lens leans into class tensions visually and tonally. And we do also see lots of people in the film also calling him a gypsy. So even though you might not have like that visual representation, it was verbalized. Now, the 2026 version flattens the outsider dynamic without really deeply interrogating it. So the result is the novel's racial and class undercurrents is just completely muted. We also have to get into the violence and the cruelty. So 1939 softens the brutality. I think they were really focusing on watchability for that time. Whereas 2026 stylizes obsession for intensity and makes it a vibe. It also turns abuse into kinks, which I felt was kind of low-key problematic in a way. However, neither of them, I can be objective and say, neither of them fully captured the systematic cruelty of the novel. I think one made it tragic and the other made it just more aesthetic. And then when I think about the ending, yes, the ending, both of them cut the second generation. Both stop at Catherine's death, which means both of them remove, the chance for renewal, the cycle breaking, literacy being elevated again, the moral correction and all the things. And I think that is the most important structural loss, because without the second generation, again, you're left with passion, decay, an open gaping wound. Instead of we get passion, then we get consequences, then we get repair. And also we have to look at the genre, right? Because the novel is a generational story. It's a tragedy, but it has a restorative ending. But the 1939 version gives us Gothic tragic romance, okay? 2026 gave us aesthetic, psychological, dark romance. And none are identical, none of them. But only one completes the argument, and had room maybe for more. I don't know. We'll see. So now we need to move on to the bigger question. Why do we keep misreading this book? And why will we keep arguing about it for the next 200 years? Because here's the thing. I might not be around in the next 200 years. Hopefully YouTube is, so that you can, get to see my opinions on everything. But I know this is a novel we will be talking about for years and years to come. Let's zoom out for a moment because this isn't just about one adaptation. This is about cultural memory. Because for nearly 200 years, Wuthering Heights has been a topic of conversation. And the first adaptation, I think, has been out for about 90 years, and it has been marketed as a tragic romance. And look, I don't have to agree with it, but I can understand why. The imagery is irresistible. Two lovers on the moors, wind, storm, I cannot live without my soul, all of that. It's cinematic. And the inheritance bit, the power bit, the patriarchal bit, the legal property manipulation bit, literacy as redemption and all of that. It's not really the vibe. So culturally, we freeze the book at Catherine's death. And I think it's because it's emotionally explosive. It's clean. It's mythic. And I think myth sometimes is a lot easier than structure. And as a society, we'd much rather tackle something that is easier to explain and easy to tie up in a neat bow instead of provoking thought and further commentary. Now, I also understand tragic romance sells, okay? We love doomed couples. We love Romeo and Juliet. We love Titanic. We love star-crossed lovers against society. I mean, it's simple, it's digestible, it feels grand and all the things. But Wuthering Heights is not love against the world. It truly isn't. It's love rotting inside the world. And I think that's harder for people to package. I mean, again, give me a budget. I will package it, but I can also be objective and understand that, hey, I'm passionate about it. Directors aren't, and they're also hedging their bets on what will sell well. Another point is the book is structurally messy. It's messy, let's be honest. The novel is complicated. I did a whole family tree to help y'all. Non-linear narration, framed storytelling, two houses, two generations, legal mechanics, moral ambiguity. Again, you need that family tree open beside you. You need to track the time jumps. You need to remember who inherits what. Look, some people might say it's hard to film. I don't think it's that bad. It might be hard to pack that in 2 hours, even 2.5 hours. So I know adaptations compress, they simplify, all right? They remove the whole second generation part of it because it feels like a sequel. But I think that compression changes the thesis. Again, if you end at Catherine's death, it's tragedy. If you end with Hareton and Kathy, kind of planning a future, okay, it's restoration, it's hopeful. And that choice really defines the genre. Now, listen, again, I don't expect anyone to do it in one film. I am team give it the wicked treatment. Give us part 1 and give us part 2. I think that is very reasonable. I also understand we will be talking about this for 200 years to come because we prefer passion to patience. The second generation is quieter. There's no grand speeches. There's no storminess. There's no confessions, major, really. No self-destructive declarations. It's small. It's important. But I can be objective and say it's smaller. It's incremental. And it's someone, again, learning to read. It doesn't trend. It's slowly falling in love. The moral spine of the book. And as a society, we have to be honest that we are not patient, and patience doesn't necessarily, it's not as cinematic as obsession is. And also discomfort. We have to talk about discomfort because discomfort gets rewritten and the novel is uncomfortable because it's violent. It's psychologically ugly. It doesn't flatter the characters one bit. So what do we do culturally with it? We smooth things over. It's like history, right? We don't want to tackle history head on. It makes people uncomfortable. So we have to soften things. We have to smooth things out. We have to, throw aesthetics on it. We have to, in this case, romanticize it. We turn Heathcliff into this dark heartthrob instead of a man who weaponizes the legal system to ruin lives and because he abuses people. Because it's easier to want him than to be afraid of him, But again, Brontë didn't write him to be safe. She wrote him to be disturbing, and she wrote him to disturb you. So even though with all of that, it will endure anyway, okay? It will endure. And yet, look, despite all the misreadings, despite the flattening, we are still here. I am talking about it. You're talking about it with me in the comments. We're arguing about it because the book resists simplification. It is so morally unstable. It doesn't hand you a clean hero. It doesn't give you comfortable love. It forces you to wrestle with so many things. It forces you to wrestle with class, race, property, trauma, revenge, but also repair. And every generation projects their feelings onto it. You know, I'm projecting my feelings, others will too. And that is why it survives. That's why it can't be spoiled. Because a classic doesn't die when it's adapted poorly. It actually renews itself. And every reading and rereading will become a new argument. So with all that, here is where I land. This is a novel about power, hierarchy, obsession, and whether cruelty can be stopped and interrupted. The central conflict is about two men battling over property and legitimacy. And then Kathy and the next generation just become extensions of that war. The 1939 film romanticizes it, but it preserves the bones of the first half. It understands the jealousy engine. It understands the class tension. It just ends too early. Now, the 2026 film intensifies obsession. It leans into aesthetic boldness. However, it weakens the structural engine. It flattens the hierarchical tension. And by cutting the second generation as well, it doesn't even give us a cure. So neither adaptation, movie, let's be clear, adapts and tells the whole story. Only the novel completes its own argument. And that argument ends not in passion, not in ghost, not in eternal yearning. It ends in literacy. It ends in inheritance corrected. It ends in two young people choosing not to replicate violence. And that matters. Because when we reduce Wuthering Heights to a toxic love story, we miss the warning. And when we cut the second generation, we also cut the hope. Now, as always, I want to hear from you in the comments. Let me know if you prefer the tragic ending, or if you think the restoration and hopeful story arc is essential. But also, we need to talk about whether adaptations owe us structural fidelity, or if reinterpretation is part of the point. But also, if we're going to do a reinterpretation, can we agree that we need a different title for that project? But also, more importantly, and this is a bigger question, what deep dive do you want me to do next? Should I compare the Brontë sisters? Because I did tell y'all I'm a Brontë babe and I've been since high school. Do you want me to bring in Jane Eyre? Do you want me to compare the two? Do you want me to rope in all the books by the Brontë sisters that we have? Or maybe you want me to go down the Rebecca route. Rebecca is one of my standout favorites. It's my favorite novel. Or maybe we should tackle another misread classics. Again, let me know in the comments, because look, if you've made it this far, one, you officially know 100% of the story, not the 50% that adaptation tells us. You know the whole thing, but also you have earned the right to let me know what you would like to see next on the channel. So if you haven't already, now's a great time to like the video, share the video, tell a friend, but also subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I drop new videos every week and I go live with my friend Francesca every Thursday. Now, if you still haven't gotten enough of me and you'd like to get more content, I have lots of videos here on the channel, so be sure to check them out. I'll include one recommendation here on the end screen. But until then, I'm looking forward to talking to you in the next one. Bye for now.